Today I'll be talking about my work as a watershed outreach associate with the University of Illinois Extension. I work in two phosphorus priority watersheds, the Embarras River and Little Wabash River watersheds in east central and southeastern Illinois. So today I'll discuss some of the outreach activities I've done through Extension, and I'll be talking about watershed planning as well. Good afternoon, everyone. My talk will be a little bit different than the ones you've heard before. So I am not a researcher full-time. I do a little bit with Extension, but the research that's been talked about today is really important, but it's not going to do any good if we can't disseminate that information to the public and to the farmers we're working with. So that's where Extension comes in and many of the other organizations that we get to partner with. So I'm going to share a little bit today about what I do, but also my counterpart. Her name is Haley Haverback-Gruber, and she is in Northwest Illinois. So we're the two watershed outreach associates for the state with Extension right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do every day. But before we get into that, we're going to do some background information. So whenever I'm talking to the public, one of the first things we talk about is what is a watershed. Some people aren't sure, and it's actually the land that water drains across or under on its way to the nearest water body. And so whenever I'm talking with kids, a lot of times the first thing they'll say is, it's a shed made out of water, duh. It's like, no, that's not what a watershed is. So watersheds, they come in all shapes and sizes. You're in one all the time. The way they work is that smaller sub-watersheds feed into larger ones, so just think the smaller streams feed into bigger streams and eventually into the Mississippi, in our case, to the Gulf of Mexico. We all live in a watershed and we all impact it daily, so that's the point we try and get across to anyone that we talk to, the public, farmers, kids in general. We can all influence our water quality here, but also downstream. And so this is a diagram just to show how water moves. It's moving to those nearest water bodies, rivers, lakes, and streams, and to the ocean. And so one thing I like to do whenever I'm talking with people is figure out your watershed address. And so this sounds kind of silly, but you are in a watershed all the time. So let's figure out where we're at right now in the I Hotel. This map is actually my favorite map of the state of Illinois. It's the major watersheds around the state. And so let's zoom in here. Right now we are in a HUC 8, which is the Embarras River watershed. And so HUC stands for Hydrologic Unit Code. Every single watershed has its unique code to identify it. And so this is the Embarras here that you can see. You can see it starts in Champaign County and goes all the way down to Lawrence County, where the Embarras converges with the Wabash River. And so the Embarras is actually a little over 1.5 million acres in size. And so to zoom in on that, so this is kind of counterintuitive, but a HUC 10 watershed is actually smaller than a HUC 8. The number goes up, but the size goes down. And so to zoom in, this is Champaign County. You can see the boundary there on the southern part. And so that is the HUC 10 we're in, is the east branch of the Embarras River. And it's about 122,000 acres in size. And then we go down to a HUC 12. So that's zooming in even further into those sub-watersheds. And you can see that's Savoy there, the red dashed lines on the southern part, and then Champaign is on the west and Urbana on the east. So we are in the town of Savoy, Embarras River watershed right now here at the I Hotel. So that's just for your reference, that's where you are. Okay, and so when we talk about water pollution, it's broken into two categories, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. There's point source pollution and non-point source pollution. And so point source is something that we can literally point out. We can see where that water is coming from, and we can measure the contents of it, so we can figure out what pollutants are in the water, how much is there, the concentration or the load, and then we can address that issue more directly because we know where it's coming from. On the other side, there's non-point source pollution, and that's basically everything that doesn't fall under a point source. So it's a little harder to define, but it's those things that are on the landscape, and as water is moving across the landscape towards those water bodies, it's picking up stuff, and it's taking it into the water body. So that's things like excess fertilizers, oil, grease, toxic chemicals, things that are spilled on the landscape and that move to those water bodies. So keep that in mind as we move forward. And I know some of this has been covered already, but it's always good to recap when you're talking to the public, just what exactly are we talking about? Why is this important? And so we're talking about the Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone. That's the big issue that we're trying to address. Hypoxia is low oxygen in water, and so one of the leading causes of hypoxia is excess nitrogen and phosphorus. And so what happens is whenever we have excess amounts of those nutrients, algae growth is promoted because they eat the nutrients. And so as they are eating and their population is growing, they eventually have to die, right? And so as those things die, they decompose, and that's when hypoxia occurs, because the decomposition process sucks oxygen out of the water and takes it away for the life that's living there. And so in the Gulf of Mexico, this is actually the hypoxic zone from 2019, this past summer. They measure it every summer in size. The area that's dark red and outlined in black, that's the actual hypoxic area where oxygen is below 2 milligrams per liter. And so life can't exist in that area. It's too low of oxygen. And so the sea life that can swim out of that area will, and they'll be able to survive, but the ones that can't move or are just too slow, they will die. And so that's a big hurt for the fishing industry down there, for tourism, because it's not pretty when you have algae on the water either, things like that. And so actually the 2019 hypoxic zone was the 8th largest since they started mapping these in 1985. And so Illinois contributes to this, obviously. That's why we're talking about this today. And this was a study that was completed in 2008. It was a modeling study. And they saw that Illinois was actually the #1 contributor of both nitrogen and phosphorus to this problem in the Gulf of Mexico. And so Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana were the top 3 for nitrogen, which makes sense. We grow a lot of corn. We use a lot of fertilizer. And then for total phosphorus, Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa were the top 3 there. And so what was done to address this? The Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy was released in 2015. Several states, actually 12 in the Mississippi River Basin, were asked to create plans like this by US EPA. And so Illinois complied and developed this strategy in 2015. And so it addresses all of those types of pollutions that we talked about earlier, so the point sources and the non-point sources, but also urban stormwater. And it was written to address that Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone, but also the local issues that we can see here in our own state. We can still have algae blooms and fish kills that can occur in our own area, so we need to address those as well. And so the goal of the nutrient loss reduction strategy was to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus losses by 45%. That's the overall goal, those loads that are coming from the state. But we do have an interim goal to reduce total phosphorus by 25% and nitrate nitrogen by 15% by the year 2025. So that's just 5 years from now. Those are our goals that we're working towards. And so in the nutrient loss reduction strategy, they broke up where were these sources coming from of nutrients, what is the main contributor. And so they saw for total nitrogen that about 82% of that is coming from agricultural sources. When you break that into nitrogen, it's about 80% coming from agriculture. Total P is a different story. It's about 50-50 from those point sources and agriculture. And so again, point sources, primarily we think of like wastewater treatment plants in municipalities where they're dealing with human waste. And so in the nutrient loss reduction strategy, they created these maps of the major watersheds. So again, this is like the map I showed you earlier, the major HUC-8s throughout the state. And they did this on a point source and non-point source basis to try and determine how much of the nitrogen and phosphorus were coming from respective areas. And so this is actually the point source map that was in the nutrient loss reduction strategy. And you can see that Chicagoland, the darker the color, the more nitrogen that's coming from that watershed. So Chicagoland is really lit up here on this map. And I usually ask the crowd, why do you think that is? You know, we have more people in that area. They're treating a lot more waste, so that makes sense. And they did this on the non-point source side as well. So you can see it's much more spread out throughout the northern and central part of the state. And again, I'll ask, why do you think that is? And normally someone can figure out it's typically tile drainage in this part of the state. So nitrate just leaches with water whenever it's draining through the tile, and that's typically one of the main contributors of why we see this much nitrate loss in this part of the state. And so they did the same thing for phosphorus. Again, the point source is on your left, and so Chicago lights up again, as does the Upper Sangamon, which is where Decatur is. So we have a lot of human waste, but also ADM is in Decatur, so they process grain. So we see higher phosphorus loss in those areas. And then for the non-point source side, again, I ask the crowd normally, why do you think this is? And they can figure out that we have more rolling topography in southern Illinois. We're losing more soil. And so typically you lose more phosphorus when you're losing soil because phosphorus absorbs the soil particles. And so that's true in parts of western Illinois as well. And so what occurred from this, part of what occurred, was they created priority watersheds throughout the state of Illinois. And so the orange ones are phosphorus priorities, and the blue ones are nitrogen priorities. And so I am actually based in the Embarras River and Little Wabash River watersheds, which are in east central and southeastern Illinois. They are phosphorus priorities. And then my counterpart, Haley, who I mentioned earlier, is in two nitrate nitrogen priorities up in northwest Illinois. So we're working with farmers to help them implement best management practices, conservation on the ground to help reduce nutrient losses in their respective watersheds. So keep going. So these are some of the practices that farmers can implement. We do directly work with farmers the most. We do work with other stakeholders as well, as I'll talk about later on. But you all are familiar with these are strategies we can use to help control soil erosion and nutrient loss. So these are things we're trying to promote to growers. Okay, so how are we doing? The biennial report was actually released in November of last year, and Extension had a huge role in helping write this. So Eliana Brown and Kate Gardner are in the crowd today, and their crew did a lot of work on this. So this is just an update. Whenever we talk to people now, we're telling them how are we actually doing throughout the state. And so things aren't as great as we would hope they would be by now. So the 1980 to 1996 baseline period is what they are comparing our current years to now. So that first column is the baseline that they developed in the nutrient loss reduction strategy out of water quality data. 2013 to 2017 is what we're comparing it to. So you can see from water yield that we have had a 13% increase in the amount of water flowing through our rivers in the state. We have had a 7% increase in nitrate N losses, and we've had a 26% increase in total P losses. And so this was done by Dr. Greg McIsaac as part of the biennial report. So remember, we wanted to try and reduce nitrate nitrogen by 15% and total phosphorus by 25% by 2025. So we are going in the opposite direction. One thing big to note, though, is that the point sources actually, on the top left, they have reduced their phosphorus losses by 24% since 2011 to 2018. So the point sources, again, that's things like wastewater treatment plants, have really seen a reduction in phosphorus. And so now we're starting to think, we want to keep conservation practices voluntarily adopted. We don't want to have farmers forced to do anything, and that's the way we want to keep it. But now we're starting to see a shift of the point sources are reducing their phosphorus loss. Now we need to do more throughout the rest of the state as well. And for nitrogen, again, they also reduced that, I think, by about 10%. So they are making strides forward. Just to show you some of that data, these are the nitrate N load estimates from the major rivers. So that baseline, again, from 1980 to 96 is the black bar, and then the gray bar is 2013 to 2017. This one is actually easier to understand. This is the percent changes. So you can see we're in the Embarras right now, for example. Nitrate N loads have changed or increased by 28% from 2013 to 2017 compared to that baseline. And you can see how some of the other major rivers in the state have shifted as well. And this is the same thing for total phosphorus. So the Embarras actually has only gone up 3%, but my other watershed, the Little Wabash, has gone up 51%. And you can see some of the other big percent changes that have occurred in that time period. But also, I want to show you the changes in water flow. So it's important to note that water flow has increased too, and that helps explain some of the increase that we're seeing in nutrient loss. It doesn't explain it all, but when you have more water flowing, you're going to have a higher load flowing down the river too. So that's part of the problem. Okay, so now I was asked to share some about what I am doing and what my counterpart are doing across the state. And so there are just two of us in the state for now, and I hope we can get more in the future. It's a really great role, and it's needed, definitely. That's what we're seeing, is this role is definitely needed around the state. So we do a lot of the typical extension programming that you think of, creating field days and workshops, having public meetings and gatherings, doing education for kids and farmers and public in general, writing fact sheets, all of that. So it's busy, every day is different, and we do a lot. And so one of the big things that we've done is created a nutrient loss reduction podcast. So we release an episode about every month. We are up to episode 23, and actually have recorded part of 24 today with some people here. So you can access this on, it's on Todd Gleason's website, WILL.org. You can go, we feature different topics every episode, so looking at how to implement different best management practices. And some of you in this room have been on the podcast before, so we'll feature a farmer typically, and then an expert in that practice as well. And Todd plays that on his radio show that he has every afternoon too, if you're familiar with that. So that's been a really great outreach effort for us. And this is actually some of the people who are on one of our episodes at the Farm Progress Show in this picture this summer. And of course, like I said, we do field days and educational programs. So we try and demonstrate soil health properties, how to build healthy soil and why it's important. We go out in the field with farmers and help them figure out how to manage things like cover crops or other conservation practices. And Haley and I both do a lot of outreach in those ways and with kids in general too. One big thing that we did last year was we helped organize the Cover Crops, Midwest Cover Crop Council's annual conference. It was hosted in Illinois. And that was the first time we actually were able to host that conference, which was really exciting. We had over 100 people on the second day, farmers and professionals like you all to come and learn about cover crops, and different experts from around the Midwest came and spoke as well. Another thing that we do is the Advanced Soil Health Training. And so this is a program that was originally started by American Farmland Trust. They've done 2 rounds in the state, and we're currently on our 3rd round. We're doing it in the tri-state area, so it's southern Illinois, southwestern Indiana, and western Kentucky. And so Extension has been working with Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, the Nature Conservancy, and ZMA's Foundation. That's myself and a couple colleagues, and then John Pike, an agronomist who's in the room too, down in southern Illinois. We have all been working together to do this program. So it's a series of 6 workshops over about 15 months of time. So we've done 4 of the workshops so far. We actually have our 5th next week, and we'll wrap up in June of this year. And so we have a group of about 22 professionals, and it's a good variety of conservation professionals, ag industry, and farmers who come and learn these advanced soil health techniques that they can then take home and teach their neighbors and friends. So it's a train the trainer type of program. And the next round will be starting, and we're calling it the bi-state area. My counterpart Haley will be working on that with some other extension colleagues and Illinois corn growers up in the Illinois and Iowa area starting in June. So that's been a really great program for us. One thing I want to talk about as well is the study that Dr. Nick Sider, he was here earlier actually, but he is working on categorizing beneficial and pest insects in cover crops compared to non-cover crop fields. And so some of my colleagues in Extension were able to get a grant with him to do this study, and I was able to help along with some other colleagues. We had sites all around the state this past spring, about 3 weeks before planting and 3 weeks after. We were comparing fields with cover crops and fields that were very close by without cover crops. So this is an example of what the setup looked like. This was a field with no cover crops in it, and you can see the traps there in the middle of the field. We did 5 sets of traps in each field. It was a lot this spring because it was so wet. They were actually out there a lot longer than we intended, but it was a really great study. And this is a zoom in. We did a pitfall trap, a sticky trap, and a shingle trap to look at slugs as well. So pitfall catches those insects that are moving across the ground, the sticky trap catches those flying, and then the shingle trap looks at slugs. We did sweep netting as well throughout the summer, or in the spring too. So this was a great program. We had a field day in Effingham actually this summer where we had farmers come out and learn about some of the findings that we had seen and how they could actually go out and do some of the sampling on their own. So it was really applied in the field, diagnosing issues. This field actually had a slug problem as well. So really going out there and just figuring out why did this happen and how can we fix it if you see this in your field. Okay, so another big part of what Haley and I do is watershed-based planning. And so some of you might not be familiar with this, but watershed planning basically helps us address all of those water quality issues that we're experiencing. And it can be in a HUC 12, so that smaller size watershed, all the way up to a HUC 8 or bigger if you wanted. We found that it's more successful in smaller size watersheds, but it addresses all those issues, and then it prioritizes solutions and how we can address those problems that we're seeing. So it's a really collaborative effort, and Haley and I get to facilitate those conversations in our watershed and help develop those plans with local stakeholders. And so this is one thing that Haley has going on. She is in the Lower Rock, and so they have quarterly meetings going on where they discuss with the Soil and Waters and other stakeholders some of those priority areas, and then they're sharing education programs, trying to get conversations going about watershed planning in that area. She is also working in the Mill Creek, and they actually just submitted a grant to Illinois EPA, a 604B grant, to get funds to write a watershed plan in that area. So again, a watershed plan is basically a plan of attack of how can we get more conservation on the ground, more cost share flowing through the watershed, That's the idea that we're going for. So we're having a lot of meetings within our watersheds with stakeholders, pulling them from all different walks of life, trying to get them in the same room to talk about these issues. And then, so Haley also, they applied for a grant through Illinois Farm Bureau, one of the nutrient stewardship grants, to do a series of meetings sometime this spring where they're talking with farmers in their watershed about some of their resource concerns, water quality issues that they're seeing, and trying to just gauge their interest in developing a watershed plan in this part of the state. And so I'm doing similar work as well in my 2 watersheds. So the Embarras River watershed currently has a plan in place that was last updated in 2011. We have a really active group of stakeholders currently that are working towards updating the plan, and several of you in this room were a part of that, and so it's great to see you all here today. But we had a great group come together last summer and fundraise money to help support a watershed plan update. So we actually applied for a Section 319 grant through Illinois EPA that would cover 60% of the cost to update the plan, but we did have to have a 40% match to get that grant, and so we actually were able to fundraise that match, which was really, really exciting. This was a stakeholder meeting that we had in June, and we had about 50 people all come together in the same room. And the Coles County Soil and Water actually submitted that application for us, and we're hoping to hear in the next couple months or so if we received funding. But this was the amount of money that actually was fundraised throughout the watershed, so a little over $75,000. And this was by Illinois Farm Bureau was a huge contributor. The soil and water conservation districts in each county contributed. Different organizations just throughout the watershed, even private landowners, cooperatives, all came together behind this effort. They saw the importance of writing and updating a watershed plan. So it's really, really exciting to see that happening. And so in the meantime, as we're waiting to hear if we got the grant from Illinois EPA, we actually hosted a series of meetings in January, just last month. We went around to 9 of the counties within the watershed, and we had meetings actually with 10 of the counties, 2 were together, where we just met with farmers and talked about their resource concerns and what tools they would like to see available to them and to help them improve water quality within their watersheds. And so these 9 meetings were actually funded by an Illinois Farm Bureau nutrient stewardship grant as well. You can see we had a whole bunch of different settings. Our first meeting was in a coffee shop. We were meeting at the Soil and Waters, the Farm Bureaus, just getting people pulled together. We would serve a meal, and then we would just have a conversation. It was very casual, but we got a lot of good feedback, and it was very interesting. The Embarras is a long watershed, so it starts in Champaign and goes down to Lawrence, and just the variance in opinions throughout the watershed was very interesting too. And we heard a lot of the same themes, but sometimes things are just different. The South is getting too much water from up north, and things like that. So it was just really neat to hear some of those thoughts. So some of the takeaways, these are just some major themes that were pretty consistent throughout all 9 of those meetings that we had in the Embarras. A lot of farmers, most of them, desire to implement conservation, and some are doing it without cost share and will do it, but a lot still desire and need that assistance to be able to get some of these conservation practices on the ground, which a lot of this is obvious, but it's good to reaffirm, and it was neat to hear that these themes were consistent throughout the watershed. Some are successful using cover crops, but a lot are having problems or challenges with adopting them, and some haven't even tried them because they've heard of challenges with their other neighbors. So these are things just to be aware of that we can really reach out to those folks, I think more one-on-one, just to have conversations to get their foot in the door, especially with things like cover crops. And cost share dollars to support implementation of those practices would help increase adoption. That's one thing they said, if they had more cost share, they would be doing more of these things or more assistance in general. They desire more education, so farmer to farmer, but also for their landowners. That was another consistent theme, especially for absentee landowners who might not be present, and just landowners in general. They really want education that's targeted towards them to help them understand why these things are important and needed on the landscape, so that the landowners could potentially help the farmer implement some of these practices with some money assistance. And then another big thing that was said a lot was local research is desired, which I found really interesting. Several of the counties mentioned that they want plots in their own county. They want to know what's happening on the soil types that they work with every day and in the climate, and they want to hear what their neighbor's doing. They want to see if their neighbor's being successful with this, can I then do this, or I will be able to do this more easily if I see that they are doing this. So that was just some of the big takeaways that we saw throughout the watershed. And so another thing that I have going on too is in the Salt Creek, which is a sub-watershed of the Little Wabash in Effingham County. And so if you can see that on the map on the left, the Salt Creek is the one that's outlined in white. So it's primarily in Effingham County. And this is a new collaboration that we're actually working on with a professor here at U of I. His name is Dr. Daniel Snyder, and he's in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. So he actually has a class of students that is working on developing a watershed plan for the Salt Creek. So the Salt Creek doesn't have a plan currently. This will be basically starting from scratch. But this was a really exciting new collaboration for us. It was partially funded by the Lumpkin Family Foundation, and then also we had support from Illinois EPA to do this as well. And so the Salt Creek, if you can see, it's zoomed in there on the arrow here. This is the Salt Creek. It's a Huck 10. It's made up of 3 Huck 12 subwatersheds. And it's approximately 61,000 acres in size, with most of that being in Effingham County. And so there you can see the 3 Huck 12s that make up that watershed. But we actually had a meeting there last Friday, so very fresh coming off of that. It was a stakeholder meeting. This one was a little bit different than the Embarras because we actually pulled in people from the public as well and from public organizations like the Health Department, the City of Effingham, the Village of Teotopolis, if you're familiar with that, is part of this watershed as well. And the class of students actually came down to the watershed and met with the stakeholders. So it was really, really neat. We had about 45 people in the room, half of which were students, half local stakeholders, and we just had breakout conversations discussing their issues and what they would like to see written into the plan. So it was a really, really neat collaboration, and excited to see where that goes in the future. And so one other thing I want to mention is that with NREC partnered with me this past December, actually, we worked on a little soil sampling pilot project where we sampled 7 fields throughout Effingham County in that Salt Creek watershed. We worked with 4 producers to do this, and we worked with KSI Labs too. They came out and did the sampling. 3 spots were sampled in each field for nitrate nitrogen at 1 foot and 2 foot depths. And so we're hoping to do this again pre-plant and then pre-side dress, and then post-harvest we'll do a cornstalk nitrate test. And so this is a map actually from our Effingham plat book. It just shows the Salt Creek there, and that was some fun. I went and clicked through the plat book to try and find producers within the watershed specifically that we wanted. So that was a neat study, and we hope to look at phosphorus too, since we're in a phosphorus priority watershed. We really want to target on that as well. So that is some of the activities we have going. I'm happy to take any questions if you have any, and thank you very much.